Okay, guys, here we are on the fourth and last little piece of the respiratory lecture. We're going to talk about ventilation, which is just breathing, and then we'll talk a little bit about regulation of ventilation rate. Okay, so when you talk about breathing, it all boils down to the relationship between pressure and volume. Okay, so Boyles Law states that the pressure is going to be have an inverse relationship to volume, which just means that if you change the volume, so for example, you increase the volume, you're going to decrease the pressure. And this has to do with the fact that, remember, the pressure is the number of molecules in a particular volume or space. And so if you give those molecules more space, they're going to be less pressure. Okay, so I like to look at it like this. So here are little molecules, made them happy faces just for fun, and they are crammed into this particular little box. That is the volume that they are allowed to occupy. So if we take the same number of molecules, okay, so the same number of happy faces, and we put them into a smaller box, they now are going to be put under pressure. So the amount of pressure will go up. So if you have a larger volume, you're going to have a lower pressure. They're less crammed together. If you have a smaller volume, you're going to have a higher pressure. So the way that breathing works is we're going to change volume first, and then pressure changes as a result. So please make sure you're very comfortable with the cause and effect. Right? So sometimes I have people trying to tell me that the pressure changes first and then the volume changes as a result. That is not correct. Volume changes first, then pressure changes as a result. Okay? So your lungs inflate because the volume of your thoracic cavity changes. That then changes the pressure, and then the air will move towards the lower pressure. Okay? So let's talk about the particular pressures that we're going to talk about. So when you look at the lungs, there's three different pressures that you can look at. You can look at atmospheric pressure, that's just the pressure, the total pressure of the molecules outside of you. Then you have the intrapulmonary pressure. Intra means inside. So the intrapulmonary pressure is the pressure inside of the lungs. Okay, so inside. Then you have the intrapleural pressure, and the intrapleural pressure is the pressure in the space between the two serous membranes. Remember, you have your pleural cavity, and then you have the visceral pleura, which is on the lung itself, then you have the parietal pleura, and then there's this space in here. That space right there should remain negative because that helps keep the lungs kind of attached and pulled onto the thoracic cavity. And so if you get a puncture, for example, somebody stabs you with a knife, what can happen, that's terrible, what can happen is your lungs can collapse because you lose this negative pressure. So remember, negative pressure is like a sucking, right? Like a vacuum cleaner. It vacuums and holds the lungs out. If you lose that negative pressure, then it could collapse in and you'll have to restore the negative pressure. Okay, but for my story is only going to be looking at these two. We are going to look at the intrapulmonary pressure in comparison to atmospheric pressure. We're not going to look at the intrapulmonary pressure because that's going to remain a negative. So the atmospheric pressure is not going to change, and so we call that neutral. And then what's going to happen is the intrapulmonary pressure is going to vary between positive and negative. Positive just means above atmospheric pressure, and negative means below atmospheric pressure. That's what we're going to look at. Okay, so let's talk about how this works. So remember, the very first thing in our cause and effect is we got to change the volume of the thoracic cavity. First, let's talk about thoracic cavity. So here is your thoracic cavity. It's the space above the diaphragm. Okay, so all of this, that empty space inside your body there's your thoracic cavity. At the bottom of the thoracic cavity is a sheet of skeletal muscle that is called the diaphragm. And what the diaphragm can do is like a dome shape. So when it's relaxed, it creates a dome shape like this. It kind of sits sort of on top of the liver right there. And then what it can do is it can contract and relax. And as it contracts and relaxes, it can pull down the floor of the thoracic cavity. And that's going to change the volume, the space, internal space in that thoracic cavity. Okay, so remember, volume changes first, then pressure changes as a result. Okay, so at rest, when you're neither inhaling nor exhaling, no air going in, no air going out, the intrapulmonary pressure will be equal to atmospheric pressure. Okay, so again, that's why no air is coming in or out, because there's no pressure gradient, no drive to move in or out of the lungs. Okay, so when you begin an inhale, in the inhale, the diaphragm, which was a dome shape like this, contracts. And as it contracts, it flattens out, and as it flattens out, it's going to pull the entire thoracic cavity down with it. And what that's going to do is that's going to increase the volume in the thoracic cavity. And when you decrease the volume, what happens to pressure? Opposite. An increase in volume is going to create a decrease in pressure. Okay, so there's more space for those molecules. That makes it so that the pressure is going to go down. Remember that inverse relationship. That means that now the pressure is less than atmospheric pressure. That's the same as like a vacuum. So what happens is the air is then going to move from higher atmospheric pressure to lower intrapulmonary pressure. High to low, that's it. So the reason air is going into your lungs is just because it's following its pressure gradient. That is the only reason it goes in. So notice that the lungs don't really do anything. They're not pulling it in. They're not doing anything like that. All there are just accepting the air as it goes into the lungs. Okay? So your lungs inflate because they're being filled with air as it goes in. The lungs don't do anything themselves. Okay? Okay, now when we exhale. So when you exhale, so you draw it in. When you exhale, what happens is the diaphragm is going to relax. Okay, so instead of being pulled down, it'll recoil back to its normal dome shape here. The volume of the thoracic cavity, so your chest space, is going to go down. And when you decrease volume, what happens to pressure? A decrease in volume means an increase in pressure. So now what we've done is we've taken those molecules and we crammed them into a smaller space. They want to escape. And so they're going to go from a higher pressure inside of the lungs to a lower pressure outside of the lungs, and that's called an exhale. So the air will just move along its concentration gradient to go out. Okay, so again, the lungs didn't do anything. Okay, it's the space in the thoracic cavity. All we did was make the thoracic cavity a smaller space that increases the pressure and that makes the air go out. The lungs don't contract. That's not a thing. Okay, so let's go through real quick one time. So here we are at rest. No air in or out. It's like equilibrium. So remember we're talking about, the fusion is the same kind of idea. The pressures are the same, so there's no drive to go anywhere. When you inhale, the diaphragm contracts. When the diaphragm contracts, the thoracic cavity gets bigger. An increase in volume means a decrease in pressure. Less pressure is now less than atmospheric pressure, so you have less space, you have less pressure inside the lungs than outside the lungs. Air moves from higher pressure out to a lower pressure in. That's going to inflate the lungs. And then When you exhale, the diaphragm is going to relax, and when the diaphragm relaxes, it recoils back to its normal dome shape. The volume in the thoracic cavity is going to go down. A decrease in volume means an increase in pressure. And so now we have more pressure inside of the lungs than we have in the atmospheric pressure. Then the air is just going to move from a higher pressure inside to a low pressure out. That's what makes the air move out. And then we'll just do it all over again. Okay, so these are called tidal breaths, which means it just comes in and out like the tides. Normal, quiet breathing. Let's real quick and see what happens when you do a forced exhale. Okay, so when you're really trying to get it all out, you're gonna feel, so try it with me. Right, you're really gonna feel the tension. The first thing is the diaphragm's just relaxing, so that can't change. But you can decrease the volume in other ways. And the reason is, if you look at the rib cage here, between the rib cage, you have these two sets of intercostal. Inter means between, costal means rib. So intercostal. And so if you contract those internal intercostal muscles, that's going to pull the ribs closer together, which is going to compress your entire thoracic cavity, which makes it decrease the volume of the thoracic cavity even more. The second thing is your abdominal muscles here, they're going to help force the diaphragm up a little bit more. Okay, so they're going to force the diaphragm up a little bit more. That'll then again decrease the thoracic cavity volume even more. Even smaller space means even more pressure. So really decreasing the thoracic volume means a really increase in the thoracic pressure. So now you've taken those molecules and you've crammed them together. And now what they want to do, they really want to go to a lower concentration. So the steeper the gradient, the increase in the rate of the movement. You've seen that already with diffusion. Okay, so when you cram them into an even greater pressure, that's going to cause them to move out with even more force. So again, lungs aren't contracting. They don't do anything except for recoil back down. Okay, so which of these are active process? When I say active, I mean that they require contractions of muscles. Okay, so a normal inhale. Yes, the diaphragm is contracting. Also the external intercostal muscles as well. Okay, so definitely a normal inhale. What about a normal exhale? No, all it does is the diaphragm recoils. It doesn't take any energy to recoil back to its original shape. So not a normal exhale. What about a forced deep inhale? For sure, right? If a normal inhale uses energy, then a deep inhale definitely does. And then a forced exhale, now what you do is you need to compress the volume of the thoracic cavity even more. And so yes, that one is definitely going to use some skeletal muscles as well. So the answer is yes, yes, and yes. So A, C, and D, those are all active processes, whereas in exhale, this is a passive process. So you could do it even if you're not alive. It's the death rattle, just sort of comes out. Okay, let's talk a little bit about ventilation, then we'll be done. The regulation of the ventilation. So in your brain stem, so just to orient yourself, here's the cerebrum. In the middle of the cerebrum is the diencephalon. There's your thalamus, your hypothalamus. Below that, in front of the cerebellum, this region here is called the brain stem, and you have two major structures in the brain stem. The first bump is the pons. The second bump is the medulla oblongata. In the medulla oblongata, you have the rhythmacy centers, and these centers, they're what set the rate of ventilation. So how fast and how deep you're going to breathe. And they do that by monitoring the concentration of carbon dioxide, oxygen, as well as the pH, or the concentration of hydrogen ions. Okay, so in your major arteries. So in your aorta, as well as in your common carotid arteries, you have some chemoreceptors, and those chemoreceptors will monitor the concentration of those chemicals. Okay, so let's look at the effect of the carbon dioxide. Okay, so the carbon dioxide is the biggest effector. And the reason that carbon dioxide is monitored even more closely than oxygen is that carbon dioxide also affects the pH, right? So it's even more important that we keep the carbon dioxide levels, you know, a particular range, because if it's too much, then it'll make the blood acidic, and then that's toxic and everything starts going bad. Okay, so it's going to directly monitor the concentration of carbon dioxide, and then that's going to send that information. So here we're going to send that information, so the chemoreceptors will monitor it. That'll send that information to the medulla oblongata, which then sends it, okay, respiratory centers, sends it out to the skeletal muscles, the diaphragm especially, and that's going to increase the rate. Okay, so oxygen is also monitored, but it doesn't have as nearly as big of an effect. Okay, so which is a little bit counterintuitive. We would think, oh, oxygen, need that, want to monitor that, but really it's the carbon dioxide. So if you look at this graph right here, when you have even kind of small changes in carbon dioxide, you're going to have immediately changing the respiratory rate. Okay, so pretty significant changes in respiratory rate. And again, that has to do with its relationship to changes in pH as well. Whereas oxygen, you have to have, fairly significant changes in oxygen before you can before it starts changing the respiratory rate. Okay. That's all I have for you now. Bye, have a good day.